Welcome to the Deer Society Podcast. Here's your host, Brian Lemke.
Hey guys, thanks for tuning into the Deer Society Podcast. I'm Brian Lemke and I have with me JJ Dukart. And here with us in the Deer Society studio is Rod White. How you doing, Rod?
What up? Good.
Rod is a professional bow hunter, professional archer, and multi-medalist in the Olympics. We're going to be talking a lot about bow hunting. It's getting out of spring into summer here, so we're all starting to think about deer season, shooting our bows, and it's going to be here before you know it, 4 months here in Minnesota. So let's kick things off, Rod. Tell us a little bit about your background. Obviously, we'll talk a lot about how you got started shooting, and I want to hear a lot about the Olympics. But tell us how you kind of got started in this industry and big into archery.
All right, I'll give you the condensed version so we can talk about other stuff too. But basically, I got started when I was 12 years old. In Pennsylvania, you had to be 12 years old to hunt, period, whether it was bow or the gun. And went out, basically, short version is I went out and missed some deer with a bow, and my dad's like, hey, you gotta take some lessons. So I went to a local club, and at that time, a lot of people believed you had to learn how to shoot a recurve first before you could really learn how to shoot a compound. All I was really interested in was shooting deer with my bow. That's all I cared about. And I went into that program. I think it was called Western Reserve, and it was in a small town in Pennsylvania. Went into that range, and they had all these round targets, like what we now know as Olympic style targets, yellow center, red, blue, black, and white on the outside, circular targets, and they had these recurve bows. I was kind of disappointed because I just wanted to hunt, but I went in and shot. My dad told me basically if I didn't learn how to shoot better and I didn't go through those classes, I couldn't bow hunt. So in essence, I went and got started that way, and went through the whole year, did really well, like locally at that club, and then I think we went to a couple of tournaments locally and just shot them as kids, and I did pretty well in my division. And then I think at the end of, it would be the second year, I went to a national championship, which was convenient because it was in Pittsburgh, and went there and shot, and I think I came in something like 44th out of 46 kids. And that's when the switch turned on me, and I'm like, wow, I went from being a cocky little 12, 13-year-old kid to like, holy cow, I just got stomped, and I want to come back and I want to do it right this time. I want to win. So I went and practiced all year long, worked my tail off, came back to nationals. My goal was to be in the top 10. I think that next year I came in 8th, I think it was. And then shot again that entire year with the goal coming in the top 3, and I think I won that year. And when I did, got invited to a tournament called the World Championships, Junior World Championships in Italy. And we had a couple training tournaments and went and shot that, got second. So I was quickly ranked like second in the world. And that was a pretty cool experience. Traveled all over the world from Italy to Indonesia. Started making men's world teams at the age of 15, and I went to the Olympics at 19, won a gold, and went back again in 2000, won a bronze. And then, but in 1997, went out and made it's silly to look at it now, a hunting video on a tape. My brother and I just cruised all over the West and Midwest and up in Canada, hunting a bunch of stuff, and filmed it and made a cool little tape out of it. Like I said, it looks good if you look at now. But that was kind of my start into the TV world with bow hunting per se. And of course, I had a lot of sponsors from the Olympic Games. PSE was my major sponsor. I picked up Realtree and a lot of other hunting companies. And my sponsorships were mostly built around hunting companies. And because of that, like I was on a lot of TV shows and did a lot of elk hunts and whitetail hunts. And we filmed a lot. Gore-Tex was a big sponsor of mine. And eventually went on to be like Cabela's and Bass Pro, Cabela's and Gander Mountain, and had a pretty good position at Gander Mountain there, just doing grand openings. And we would go in the fishing section, and I would go in the fishing section. I would shoot archery, show my medals, and take people who were already in the store for outdoor reasons like fishing. They would see archery going on. I would take them over to the range and teach them how to shoot a bow, and then we would convert customers that way. So for me, the sponsorship thing was always about driving back to those sponsors, and it became a business. And I did some outfitting and guiding along the way. I've guided for elk, whitetail, of course, had my own business for whitetails, had my own business for bears, a little bit of mountain lion, which I was more so just a dog handler, if anything, for that, and antelope, muleys, you name it. So that was kind of the start. And then I met JJ at Game Fair one year, and he saw the deer call I was using and some of the footage, and he's like, dude, you got to meet my dad. So long story short.
Yeah, that was almost 10 years ago too.
Yeah.
At Game Fair in Oka, Minnesota. Why were you there? Just
I think Gander had me there for to do a seminar. I was doing a seminar on whatever I wanted to, and I did it on calling. So I really broke down, like as you see these videos now, I was really breaking down those calls and explaining that and showing some footage of that in a much more condensed version. But basically getting people to understand that deer do communicate with each other in their own language. And whenever deer do speak in certain tones and certain with certain fluctuations, it means different things to different deer. And because of that, you can use it to know when to draw or when not to draw. You can use it to bring deer within bow range, or if you're a gun hunter, you can stop them with certain calls. Some things work, some things don't. Depends on the situation. And just went over a bunch of those scenarios there. And I know you heard the call and saw it, and you're like, hey, it's my dad's.
Yeah, I watched a lot of TV growing up, and I saw you on TV, I think, that season before the game fair. And we were just walking around the show. We were working with Gabe Schaffner at the time. Yep. He was doing seminars and stuff up there. And I saw Rod White, and I'm like, and I don't even know if I knew your name exactly, but I was like, that's the guy on TV that was using the deer call that my dad invented. So met you and then pulled Mike in and went from there. So that was a good connection. Yeah.
And here we sit.
Yeah, and here we all sit in the Deer Society studio and actually launching a brand new Deer Society series with Rod that's going to be coming to you here in a few weeks, all about archery and bow hunting and tips and tactics that you can use in the field. Some things from the start, about form and things that even a beginner could use, but also some of those advanced tips that we all as bow hunters can use across the board. So that's going to be pretty cool. Tell me a little bit about what's coming from that.
Well, I think we're basically doing kind of an introduction to explain things so that people get an understanding of things. Later on, I believe we'll go more in depth on actually how to tune your bows and get really into the meat of it. But the most important thing for now, I think, is just to get the information out there for people to start understanding or wanting to understand, hopefully, how their bow works, their bow and arrow combination, understanding things like some of the segments we filmed. We talked about shooting uphills and downhills, angle compensators and rangefinders, how they work, and the subtle differences between some. We talked about bow tuning, somewhat paper tears. Gave a great example, I think, of why paper tears are important, or paper tuning is extremely important, especially when you're putting blades on a fixed blade broadhead, and how that affects accuracy, and exactly, I think, really define, which I don't know that I've seen anybody do, but we really defined why it's important. Like if you have a tear if you don't have a perfect bullet hole with your arrow going through the paper out of the bow and at longer range distances, you're going to have issues with that broadhead taking over and wanting to go in that same direction of flight at which the tear is occurring. So in our example, we had a tear that was to the left, and when we screwed a broadhead on there with fixed blades, it banked way off to the right. We got to the point in which we described we found which arrow was going to work best out of that bow by picking what the chart said was best, and we took one stiffer and one weaker. Then we gave an example of that, and you can see the one's not quite a bullet hole. It had a little bit of vertical in it. We had to take care of with a knocking point issue or a rest, either one. You change those. And then we looked at the other two arrows, and one had a left tear and one had a really left tear. So we used an example by shooting the fixed blade, showing that the fixed blade hit pretty much with the field points with that particular spined arrow. And then the other, I think it was we shot a 400 Victory VAP is what we shot. And then the other one, the stiffest one, was a 300 Victory VAP. And that one, you can see the broadhead plane and took off just like the tear. So I think explaining things like that to people will help get their head around how they need to fix things and understand how to correct things on their own and process that information. So I think that's mostly what the series is about. And then, of course, we'll relate a lot of things to hunting, talk about some form and technique that you really should be aware of.
Yeah, and based on what Rod just said, it may sound really complicated, but I think this series will really, clean that up and kind of bridge the gap between, that intense knowledge that you need for what you do with target shooting to the common bow hunter, which doesn't necessarily need all that information, but needs to pick out stuff that makes sense for their application. So just kind of bridge that gap, simplify it, and kind of build a series based on that. So
yeah, I know that sounds super complicated and probably just went right over a bunch of people's heads, but that was the point, is that we could add a visual to how we're explaining it. And I think once you start understanding how your bow is working and why your bow is how it's interacting with the arrow, you can tune your bow pretty quickly and pretty efficiently. And it's not just that. I know we talked about some other things too, but the range finding stuff, angle compensators, I don't know what else we went over. We did a lot in a day and a half.
Yeah, absolutely. Some pretty cool stuff. And that's it. Taking those complex thoughts and not that they're so complex, but breaking them down so it's simple and starting with, the front end aspects of the equipment, picking the right equipment for yourself. And once you have that equipment, then, going into how to tailor that equipment to make it the best possible. But really simplifying that. So that's going to be a really, really cool series coming soon. And you can check that on the Deer Society app. Let's talk about the Olympics. I want to hear, what was that experience like? I myself and JJ, and we all have these experiences in the woods, and a big buck comes in and we talk about buck fever and shooting under pressure. I can't imagine what it's like shooting in the Olympics, and competing on that kind of scale. What was that experience like for you?
Well, I mean, like I tell people in seminars, you've experienced it already. The things you talk about whenever you have buck fever, that's no different than the feelings that I felt whenever I was shooting in a stadium with 400,000 people watching on TV and however many people were in the stadium. There are things that happen to you physically that you can't control. Your pupils, and when you get under stress like that, your pupils dilate. There's more oxygen being delivered into your blood. You're a little stronger than what you normally are, and you have a fight or flight response system. And learning how to control that, and I shouldn't say control it, but how to work with that is the key to really understanding buck fever. And I think target archery taught me that, like right out the gate. I was very lucky. I was very fortunate. Tim Strickland was a guy who was my coach, kind of took me under his wing right away. And differently than how most people look at pressure situations when it comes to shooting a bow, I look forward to it. If I don't have any kind of excitement or enthusiasm, there's no reason to do it for me. And it relates to deer hunting exactly. So those things you felt what it's like to be in the Olympic Games. The exact same things happen to you. Some people handle it differently. Some people look forward to it and some people don't. And some people shake after the shot. Some people shake before the shot. It's that the individual characteristics change a little bit, but the fundamental things that happen to your body, you can't control. So you learn to look forward to it and you learn to want to be in those situations. And I think that's the thing that once people get their head around that, I can really start to explain what happens with target panic and fix those issues with them. I'm sure we'll talk over some of that stuff throughout the podcast series or the learning series.
Absolutely. Is there a way that a specific routine that you went through or a way that you practiced to try to prepare for that? We can do that as hunters too. Like you said, that feeling is a lot the same, which is really interesting to hear actually. Is there a way that you tried to prepare yourself in practicing, before that to deal with some of those distractions or deal with, that adrenaline? I'm sure, it's just like hunting. There's not really a way to recreate that in practice, but is there anything specifically that you did routine wise to
there were a couple things. One of the things is mental imagery. And I talk about that in seminars too. From whether you're a bow hunter or whether you're a competitive shooter, that helps the situation a lot. When you're in practice, you try to image things that are happening in a competition scenario. But it's a little more complicated in that there are certain images that I shoot in my head, depending on if I'm working on. In practice, I tend to work on my own form in particular and whatever flaws I have, trying to improve that individual thing. I don't focus all on the overall shot, and I'll run images in my head. Sometimes I'll film myself and I can see, okay, well, this is a mistake I'm making. When I do it right, I'll take that image and I'll watch it over and over and over and over again. And that image being replayed eventually replaces in your head what you need to do. Then when you go in and you're actually under pressure, you don't think about those individual things and how to fix them by any means. You just look to where you want to go. Like, a great example is learning how to drive a car. You learn to drive a car by grabbing a hold of the steering wheel first, and you turn a little bit, and your car's jerking left and right, and you have a hard time going in a straight line. But after you learn the skills of that, at a certain point, you stop thinking about how much do I need to turn this wheel to go around this corner, and eventually you just look to where you want to go. Snowboarding is another example of that. There's lots of sports that are like that, and that's exactly how archery works. Whether it's bow hunting or whether it's competition, it's the exact same thing. So explain that like in detail. It would take a little bit too much time than we have right here, but we'll get to it one of these days.
Yeah, absolutely. Creating that mental image. I see another beneficial thing that we actually talked about when shooting the archery series. was when you're shooting with a buddy, have him pull out his iPhone, and take a picture of your form. We see that, we don't see it a lot in the archery world, or at least I don't. We see it a lot in golf, where guys film their swing and, in slow motion or whatever. Well, we all have an iPhone with us all the time, pretty much, right? So whether it's slow motion or just taking a photo, of your form and being able to go back and see what you're doing wrong. We did it in the instance of shooting downhill, and we talked about bending at the waist and creating that straight line between your front arm and all the way through, your elbow and shoulder and back arm. I see that as a good way that people can practice and really do those things, kind of examine them after the fact.
Yep. And then they can even integrate that into the routine later on, shooting those images while you're practicing and having somebody film you, in a couple days or a week later, depending on how much you practice. That helps a lot because you can actually see the progression or digression, depending on whether you're shooting well or not. And you can really track that improvement. That's the only way that I know of, because you can stand there and think you're doing things right, and it sure feels like things are being done right. But in reality, if you look at it from the outside, it's not like that. I don't do a lot of coaching, but some of what I have, I would get frustrated because I would tell somebody something like, "Hey man, you're dropping your bow arm. You're dropping your bow arm. You got to keep it up until the arrow hits the target." And they, in their head, were processing as I am. Like, no, you're not. And then I would video them and I'd show it to them like, "Wow, I'm not." No, you're not. And so, building those foundations and that mental imagery helped quite a bit. And that excitement of looking forward to. For me, I learned how to shoot a bow, especially with a recurve. I shoot the same way with a compound, but I'm constantly pulling into that bow. I'm always adding pressure. I'm always moving my right side, my shoulder blade towards my spine. And when I get under pressure, that movement that I get in practice where I see my sight pin moving around because I'm doing that, that's not foreign to me anymore. Where a lot of people, they practice really hard trying to keep that sight perfectly on the target, and they squeeze the trigger or slam the trigger when everything's lined up and perfectly. Well, the problem is with a bow, we learn how to shoot a gun first. And with a gun, a bullet leaves a barrel at like 3,000 feet per second, depending on what gun you're shooting. With a bow, an arrow's leaving at like anywhere from 260 probably to 300 feet per second on most hunting setups. That's a lot of time. We refer to that as lock time. The amount of time that you have to affect that projectile before it leaves the I hate to say weapon, but the bow or the rifle, that's what we call lock time. And that time period with a bow is infinitely bigger. So what people really have to get their head around, and it all ties in together with buck fever and the experiences you have, because those adrenaline things that happen to you are going to happen when you're in a position where a 200-inch deer, or maybe an 80-inch deer, creates that feeling inside you. And you're going to be shaking. Your pupils are going to dilate. You're going to see more movement than what you normally would see. All those physiological things that are happening to you, if you learn how to shoot with that, and you look forward to it, then you kind of just go on autopilot, if that makes any sense. Yeah. So
it's interesting to hear you say that, because that's something that I deal with a lot is, when I try to focus on so much on practicing, keeping that sight frame or that pin completely steady. And it frustrates me almost to the point where I shoot. And the more you try to keep it perfectly steady and hold that pin exactly on it gets worse. So it's interesting to hear you say that, learning to shoot with that mentality.
Yeah. Your mind can't let you not aim. If I said, and everybody listening to this, if I said, don't think about pink elephants, what's the first thing that popped in your head? Pink elephants. You can't not do it. And when you're aiming, we started aiming when we were kids, throwing rocks, throwing bit. No, we didn't have sights, but you started to learn how hard to throw it, or how, maybe not as hard to get it to go where you want it to go, or you learn, just like driving a car, how much you need to turn the wheel. And once you learn all that, then you change up into that mental process, and that mental process will get you through anything. You can relate it to a lot of different things, but I think this is the short condensed version, but if people can kind of start to comprehend that and get their mind thinking about that movement's good, because that going back to that lock time, because you affect that arrow so much afterwards and your mind can't let you not aim, as long as you're looking towards the target, your body's going to self-correct. A Major League Baseball, I don't even keep up with baseball, but Major League Baseball hitters, when a pitcher goes to throw a ball, you can calculate the time that it takes for that ball at 97, 98 miles an hour to get to the bat. That batter has to make a decision before that ball ever leaves that hand, whether he's going to swing or not. At least it's what they tell me. If it's not then, it's right after, as soon as it leaves his hand, he has to make that decision. So that's an autopilot thing that you learn. I mean, you learn growing up in Little League that how these balls are coming off people's hands and you're watching. No, you're not consciously thinking about that, but your mind's processing all that information. And so with a bow, same type thing. You learn the fundamentals, how to shoot in practice, and eventually that becomes something that you just look towards the target and you get the concept in your head that, hey, my sight isn't perfectly in the middle of the target, but it's okay because that arrow is still going to go in the target because you're going to continue to aim even after that release fires. So you're self-correcting throughout the entire process.
Yeah, it's such a mental game, and it seems like the more you think about it, or try to think about it, the worse you are sometimes. You know, training your mind is an evil battle, but you know, if you can practice, you know, the better off you are. I guess we can talk about, you know, because we're on the subject, target panic. Target panic is something that I think everybody deals with at some point. What recommendations do you have? You know, how to potentially deal with that target panic? I know there's several different types of target panic.
Sure,
but
they all come back to the same core issue, or the same core problem. A good example of explaining it kind of in a different way is if I took a 2x4 and I had a 30-foot 2x4 and I laid it on the ground and I said, hey, I want you to walk to the other side of the 2x4 or to the other end of it and stay on the 2x4. At that point, your brain's going to process like, I just need to walk to the other side. I'm going to look to the other side. I'm going to go to that into that 2x4. If I take that 2x4 and I raise it 100 feet in the air and I say, I want you to walk to the other end of that 2x4, well, I mean, you're not going to fall off it on the ground. The only thing that changed is your perception of, if I make a mistake, I can fall off and break my arm, head, die, whatever. It's going to be a bad deal. So that's exactly what happens whenever you go into a scenario in which you really want to kill that animal. It's a fight or flight thing. And if you train yourself to know that, hey, when I get in experiences like this, I'm looking forward to my sight pin moving all over the place. I mean, we shot recurve and fingers in the Olympic Games. There were no scopes, no releases, no compounds. You pretty much had a stick and a string, an arrow rest, stabilizers, and a pin for a sight, or some people shot a hoop. Well, that pin, we shot at distances of up to 90 meters. So 90, 99, 77, 55, and 33 yards, roughly, with fingers and a pin. There was no scope. That pin, when you're at full draw, the size of that pin, the center of the target the 10 ring is about the size of a small grapefruit. So if you can imagine that at 100 yards, the sight pin is way bigger than what you're shooting at. You can't even see the 10 ring. So if you're looking and focusing on the target downrange, the rest of it will come. It'll take care of itself because you don't have to teach yourself to aim. And I think once I get people to understand that concept, then they can begin the learning process of changing the way they shoot so that they can then look forward to that movement. And movement's a good thing because you're not going to stop it. I mean, stand in front of a crowd full of 5,000 people with 400,000 people watching on TV. Dude, I promise you, my sight wasn't even on the target half the time. It was exciting. I mean, I didn't look at it as fear, but it was exciting. There's a lot of shaking. All of us were shaking up there. And there's just absolutely, if you could see what I saw, you would be like totally baffled as like, how did you even hit the target? I was just looking to where I want to go. And everything else takes care of itself because I learned how to do that. That walking across the 2x4, you already learned how to walk. Why would you go back to that process of, okay, I really need to I need to make sure that I'm balancing and my left foot is going right. Dude, you're going to crash. You can't look at the short end of things. You have to look downrange, the long end of things. It's like that in life with a lot of things. But get that concept, and then you can start to really change the way you shoot and your form and those things. I think you have to do that first. If you don't, in the end, you're just going to wind up in the same place where you were before.
Yeah, that pressure you felt at the Olympics, how does that compare to, like, say, your first buck or your biggest buck?
Exactly the same.
Same level?
Yeah, exact same thing. I mean, you see me shoot a lot of deer. I mean, some of them been at 4 yards and some of them been at 40 yards. But the amount of sight movement at 4.5 yards that pin was pretty much staying on the animal. But, I'm trying to hit an area about the size of a baseball and trying to always gun at the lower part of the body. For me, I put that pin right below the body line because I know, depending on the situation, the scenario the deer is in by body language, I know whether that deer is probably going to stand there and take it like a champ or he's going to drop. And if they're nervous, if they come in the calls, if you see visual clues happen with their body that indicate to me they're nervous, that's going to probably trigger a response from a deer when that bow goes off. It's going to drop, and it's going to drop a lot. So I'm aiming just below the body line on a deer in that situation. And when I say aiming, that's where I'm looking at. Right there where the very bottom of the body line of the hair is. That's where I'm looking at. If it's a situation where deer is calm, I look right at the center. But in any case, that sight pin is moving all over the place. I wish you could see what I see in my eyes. But you have to remember too, that's perception too. Like I said, your pupils are dilated. So you're seeing movement a lot more rapidly than when it's really occurring.
Well, there's so many different elements out in the field, like we kind of talked about, whether it's a mule deer or a whitetail or even a deer down south, the size of their body compared to a northern deer, how much they drop, just all these different elements. And, if they twitch their tail, they're calm, they're not, you call them in. So I'm excited to kind of break all that down with you too in this series and just kind of, get into Rod's mind on all these different elements too. So
yeah, I think like today, what we filmed today was we were talking about angle compensation and how that relates to line of sight versus horizontal distance to your target. We shoot for horizontal distance, not line of sight. You have a target that's, if you're in a tree stand, you're shooting down towards it, or you're shooting down a hill. If you're hunting Wisconsin, a prime example, if you're hunting a lot of that hilly stuff, you may be shooting down and that rangefinder says if you use a line of sight, it's 40 yards from you. Well, you might only be using, depending on that angle, you may only be using a 20-yard pin. Just there's a lot of things that go into that. I think when we broke that down, we tie that right into the hunting into things. So, okay, if I'm off, we were shooting today, I think at 35 yards at a 35-degree angle. Well, if I shot that for line of sight, that's actually like 37 and a half yards, I think it was, 38 yards. So I'm going to shoot with my setup, about 2 to 3 inches high. Well, if I had shot that deer for that and been off 3 inches high, and you add in the fact that the deer was dropping, typically that's anywhere from, it can be anywhere from 10 inches to 20 inches. Well, all of a sudden now you add that 3 on top of that drop amount, and you might have hit right where you're aiming and made a great shot, but you hit the deer really high or you shot over top of it.
And unless you're videotaping your hunt, you would never know.
You would never know.
I look at like my hunts now, even like, Curly, for example, I put a dot on the screen before the shot, watch him drop. And even though you double lung him, you're aiming a lot lower, and it's like, wow, he dropped 8 inches before the arrow even got there. It's crazy.
Yep.
Yeah, it's unreal how fast those deer can react. When you start breaking it down frame by frame, and especially slow motion. I've filmed them, in slow motion. I remember a time where there was a deer. We were in Canada, and there was a deer, and it was 10 yards away. Point blank. We were on the ground. We were in a ground blind, and in that 10 yards, that deer's close. And that deer dropped 8 inches. And we measured it, put the pen on there and in slow motion. And by the time that arrow got there, 10 yards, that deer dropped 8 inches. It's incredible how fast those deer can react, especially when they're on edge,
Right.
Well, when you talk about buck fever, that's the thing. If you're not filming those hunts, in your head, you thought that arrow hit right where it should have. I can't tell you how many times I've watched videos, whether it's myself or other people I was hunting with and filming and vice versa. You watch those videos and I know I drilled that thing. I know I did. But then you watch it on film like, whoa, how in the world did that thing, I hit it like back in the liver. Well, dude, it's not that you did anything wrong necessarily. It's that deer dropped, and if you have these other factors, these little factors into play and you add them all up, they add into big factors and big differences in results.
Absolutely. So let's start kind of at the beginning. Let's talk about equipment a little bit. And, there's all kinds of different equipment out there and different bows, different arrows, different broadheads. What do you recommend for somebody going out there? Where do you start when you're looking at a bow? What aspects do you look for, or would give advice to somebody that's going out there and looking to buy either, whether it's their first bow or change or upgrade or get something that fits them really? Well,
I think it's important to understand first, more importantly than which bow brand you pick or the model you pick or the arrow you pick or the brand, or what's important is that arrow matches that bow. That spine combination with a bow is what's really, really important above all other things. The other things are bells and whistles. But as long as you have the right arrow for the right bow, that bow will shoot. Granted, like I said, some of them may have little bells and whistles that other ones don't. I shoot a Martin Max 33. It's a pretty basic bow. It's not complicated at all. I've shot for Matthews and worked for Matthews. I've shot PSE. I've shot for Hoyt. I've shot them all. And honestly, if you don't have the right bow and arrow combination, that's what's most important. Before you pick the right arrow, the right spine arrow for that bow, you need to determine, what am I going to shoot with this bow? Some of us, I spent an incredible amount of time in the backcountry in Montana and Idaho. I usually spend 30 to 45 days by myself. out there. And when I'm out there by myself, the requirements I have in a bow are much different than what I have when I'm whitetail hunting at home. If I make a mistake with a bow out there, like say I drop it or, I drag it through some brush, I need to know that thing's going to stay together like 100%. I use them more like, I think of a bow more like a sledgehammer than I do. It's a tool. It's not something I'm in love with a brand with anything. It's just, that's what I use. And so when I'm hunting like for whitetails though, the average guy probably gets up in the morning, puts on his clothes, hopefully scent free as much as he can be, and gets to wherever it is he's hunting, whether he walks back behind his yard or he gets in a truck and drives somewhere to public land or whatever. And their equipment needs are very much so different. I mean, because you're probably not going to drop your bow on a rock. You're probably not going to drag it through brush. You're probably going somewhere you already set a stand. You're going to go up, set it on a bow hook, pull it up, set it on the rack, and there it sits, and nothing else happens to it. So, you can get away with different things. Stabilizer setups, for example. I mean, mine's very basic. And honestly, the stabilizer for me, more than anything else, helps it. I set it on my bow on my pack when I'm out west and have a stabilizer on one side and sight on the other, and it sits there. And that's what I'm more concerned about, the stabilizer, for anything else for out west. But if you're big into accuracy and you really love, wanting to know that you can shoot as best you possibly can, going with the right stabilizer setup is probably pretty important. It'll help you aim a lot better, and especially in pressure situations. So for a whitetail perspective, mass weight's not a problem for you. For me, I'm going to carry a half a pound of water before I carry a half a pound of extra bow or stabilizer accessories. So that's how you pick your bow. I mean, to begin with, and the arrows too. We talked about that today or yesterday whenever we were going through arrow spine selection, and we shot 3 different arrow spines to show how those arrows react differently. I mean, ideally, if you had one of each size and you could shoot all 3 of them like we did, you've seen one has a very acceptable tear, maybe not a perfect bullet hole, but a pretty good hole, and 2 of them were less desirable. Well, that's the one you work with, is that one to begin with. So you pick your bow first based on your needs, and you pick your arrow setup based on your needs too. If you're going to be hunting African big game, well, I mean, you're probably going to be looking at something that has a really heavy arrow, a 2-blade broadhead that's going to penetrate really, really well and go deep into a chest cavity. If you're hunting elk or bear here in the U.S., you can tone it down some. You don't need as much of a heavy setup, heavy penetrating setup. You can go with a more generalized arrow. If you're hunting whitetails, you definitely can just pick almost anything and run with it. And if you're hunting something like antelope, for example, speed's more important than anything else. So I'll pick a really light arrow. Like with Victory, you could use, what their lightest is a target shaft, actually, a 3D HV, and that arrow is phenomenal for antelope because it's so light. I think it's in my spine, I want to say it's like 6.7 grains per inch. But when I'm hunting elk, in the habitat that I'm hunting in and the scenarios I'm hunting in, I want a really heavy penetrating arrow. And so I'll run an extortion or a VAP TKO. 2 different arrows, 2 completely different purposes. If you need to go with something that's just general, you can go with any standard size arrow shaft and it'll probably work out fine for you. So that's where you begin the process. And then you go through the tuning steps, which, you can get online and find a lot of information. There's a lot of good information out there. We're going to try to put it, I think, in a much more organized fashion so that you can walk through that process super easily and finish issues that you have with your particular setup rather than looking at a general overall picture of, hey, I have a left tear, these are the things you should do, or hey, I have this tear like this, now what do I do? Well, there's a lot of information out there that's really helpful, but unfortunately it doesn't break down those individual scenarios so that you can just focus on your setup and help you be the best, most efficient, most accurate shooter that you can be for your setup.
One of the cool things that I saw when it comes to tuning in the last couple of days, we didn't have to go to the archery shop to paper tune the bow. We didn't have to go to somebody that has a bow, a paper tuner and things like that. We made our own, and we used real basic materials. We used a cardboard box and some paper. Mm-hmm. That was pretty cool. This is something that people pretty much have readily available that, you can use right at home.
Yeah, virtually. And depending on the bow you're shooting, like those Martins, one thing that's really cool about those, you can take them apart without a bow press. You just keep backing the limbs out. Don't do that with any other bow, though. I think there's one other bow out there in the market that's like, but if you did that, you're gonna get hurt. But with that bow, you can just turn it down and the limbs just relax, and then you can work on your bow. Like if you need to put in a peep or whatever. On most bows, though, you'll need a bow press. I would say, if you're looking forward to this series, it's something I would be looking for on, wherever. Find a used bow press somewhere that's going to fit your needs and your budget. That's the most expensive piece of equipment you're ever really going to need, though. Our goal isn't to take you out of a pro shop completely, but it's to get you to understand how to tune your own bow, because you'll find that once you get into a certain level of tuning, especially with broadheads, it takes a lot of time to put a bow together right. And unfortunately, at a pro shop, you just don't have that amount of time. Everybody's time's worth something. And if everybody tuned a bow is, to half of the degree of what I do, man, you wouldn't pay for it. It'd be very expensive because the amount of hours involved are pretty intense. That being said, this is, like you said, we're using a lot of simple concepts where you won't spend a bunch of money learning through the series, and you're not going to spend the amount of time that you think you probably are in your head right now. I know everything I talked about sounds super complicated and super time consuming, but it's really not. And I think that's how we're trying to put this together, to make this super simple, super easy, so that anyone can understand and you can work on your own equipment and feel very confident when you walk in the timber.
Absolutely. What, as far as broadheads go, there's a lot of talk out there about, fixed versus mechanical, and obviously, there's pros and cons to each. And when we get into fixed broadheads, you deal with planing and some different things potentially. What's your feeling on broadheads fixed versus mechanical? And do you have a preference over one?
Yeah. I mean, to be honest with you, I would not ever recommend shooting a fixed blade unless it's, a gal with a really short draw length, or a person that has a condition where they can't shoot a lot of weight. I mean, if you can shoot 50 pounds with today's bows, things have changed a lot. And I think our industry, probably our perception within our industry, even amongst people that are in our industry, if you look back just 10 years ago, a fast bow was 290 feet per second. Now a fast bow is 350 feet per second. The efficiency level of bows have gone way up compared to what they used to be. So you're able to shoot a lot less pounds and deliver the same amount of energy into that arrow than what you used to back in the day. You used to shoot a little heavier poundage. I mean, I remember going elk hunting and thinking, I got to shoot at least 70 pounds. Man, I know people that shoot 45, 50 pounds and they blow through elk every year because they have the right setup. They have the arrow tuned properly, the bow, the energy is being delivered into that broadhead properly. I would say that if you're shooting, light poundage, you're probably going to go with a heavier arrow setup. And you got to keep in mind too, I mean, you have to be realistic. If you're shooting a 40-pound bow into an animal and you hit a shoulder blade, you're not going to break that shoulder blade. So do you really have to have a setup that's crazy heavy and a 2-blade massive penetrating stuff? You really don't. There's a lot of broadheads out there, mechanicals that are out there now that work extremely well. I shoot some SWATs. I'm anxious to put those into some animals, but when I go to Oregon, I can't use a SWAT broadhead. It's an expandable broadhead. I can't use an expandable. You have to shoot a fixed blade broadhead. And even more importantly, in Oregon, they break it down to say you can't use lighted nocks, and your broadheads can't not only have to be fixed blades, they also can't be more than or less than a 90-degree angle to where the blade leaves the ferrule of the broadhead, meaning you can't have a barb type head. So it throws a lot of broadheads out of the mix, and you're left with very few options up there. Honestly, if I could shoot mechanicals, I would put mechanicals on everybody's arrows. I mean, and you'll see that whenever you see this first series when we come out, this first set of tips, you'll see what a bladed broadhead does and how much more work you have to put into tuning. I'm not saying you shouldn't put as much work into it, but it's for the average person, you're better off with an expandable type broadhead, for sure. A rear deploying expandable, to be more specific, like a Rage type broadhead and some of the SWATs. And there's a ton of them out there that all work extremely well. And that's what I would put on everybody's arrows if I could.
So somebody that's in that category, maybe pulling back lighter weight, is there a different aiming point when they go to hunt, do you think? Like, should they aim a little bit further back on the shoulder to kind of negate that broadhead performance? Or? Yeah,
I mean, you have to really understand your anatomy. If you're shooting lightweight, I mean, it's not like you're at a huge disadvantage, but you really have to understand your anatomy a lot better. So yeah, you need to study, there's a class like for elk, for example, and I don't know if we have these for a lot of other species, but Corey Jacobson has a class called Elk 101. And in that class, he breaks down and shows you, it's a skinned elk, and you can see how the muscles and the bones all are put together there. So you can make correct decisions on where you want to place your shot, especially on an elk. Obviously, we're talking about something that's, if you hit it even with my setup with 90 pounds of kinetic energy, you hit a shoulder blade, there's no guarantee you're going to go through that. Yeah. Because of the way that thing's configured, gosh dang, you can't, depending on what angle you hit it on, and that bone's not a square surface you're hitting. So when you look at broadhead penetration tests and stuff, you have to keep in mind, we're not shooting steel plates, we're not shooting pieces of tile, we're not shooting plywood, we're shooting objects that are not flat, and you're not likely to hit it square whenever you hit it. So those are things you really got to keep in mind whenever you're designing. Like, hey, I've got this lightweight setup. I have to be even more precise now on where I put that arrow at.
Yeah, and with the drop factor and all that too. But
yeah, and there again, what animals you're shooting. If you're hunting elk or you're hunting muleys, man, they take arrows like a champ. I mean, they will drop, but not near the rate as a whitetail will. And we can't control that. Gosh, our arrows. I mean, a fast arrow today is 330 to 350 feet per second would be on the real high end. Man, an arrow of that speed, you're still, I think, about a little more than a third the speed of sound. You're not going to beat that system. And I don't care how much you take your bow and quiet it down and how quiet you make sure your arrows are in flight. You put a broadhead on the end of it or even a fixed blade, you're changing the dynamics of that. And there's airflow things that happen that they make noise and they're going to hear them coming. It's just a matter of what state that animal's in. So again, going back through a lot of our video series, I think we've done those before at Deer Society. I know I've done some for you.
Touched on it a little bit. Yeah.
Yep. I mean, those are very valuable videos to go back and watch if you're a low poundage setup for sure. Higher poundage, you can get away with a lot more.
Yeah, you talk about anatomy and studying that and understanding that. Another huge thing on top of, the animal potentially dropping is angles, and thinking about those angles, what area you're in, what side you're entering on, how that's gonna, how that animal is facing, compared to where you are. And do you have any thoughts on, shooting or advice on, animals quartering towards?
Yeah, I mean, I've shot, might upset a few people, but I've shot animals in almost every position you can imagine. And some of them have been extremely lethal and other ones need a follow-up shot. For sure, quartering away shots, as long as it's not severe, are ideal. Perfectly broadside shot's good too. I mean, realize you can still hit a rib bone and things can happen bad. But when an animal, I hear a lot of people talk about you should just shoot them while they're quartered away. Well, if they're too quartered away, you got to remember those ribs are all on a line. So if they're broadside, you have, an inch, maybe on a whitetail, you have about an inch between ribs or so, depending on the size of the animal. You have slots that your broadhead's likely to sip through. Well, you turn that cage at an angle and all of a sudden now you have a wall of ribs. You're going to hit some ribs. So you have to put it in behind that last rib to get it in there where you want it to go. If you're somebody that's shooting a lightweight setup, I mean, that's, again, something people don't take into account. If you're shooting an ultralight setup, maybe you can't pull as many pounds or you chose to shoot a really light, fast arrow. That's all cool, but you need to know that like a shot like that's quartered away, that works great for me or, either one of you guys, the guys shooting 55, 60, 70 pounds, we have plenty of kinetic energy. We're not going to have a problem probably breaking a rib going in there. Person with a slow bow might be. So you have to be careful about where you get your information at and how you get your information, because there's a lot of people that talk about a lot of things that really haven't experienced it, especially with social media now. I don't want to pull my hair out because you read so many things from people that have never done anything. I mean, I want to learn from somebody who's done it. And that's more important to me. I want to, what are your credentials? Have you won things like this? If you're listening to somebody tune a bow, have you won things, or you just talk about it and you type out on a keyboard every time you see a post come up? Like, oh, I grab a chart. Hey, I saw your post about a left hair. I grabbed this gold tip chart and you got to, your arrow's too stiff or too weak, whatever the case may be.
Well, they're an expert because they made a YouTube video.
Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah. So you got to watch where you get that information, because somebody who's advising you on where to place your arrow on an animal that's quartered away, it's pretty bad advice, actually, if you think about it, for somebody who has light poundage. And they mean all well and good with that intention, but yeah, you're not in the same boat as what somebody who's shooting 70, 80, 90 pounds of draw weight, or 60 pounds even. It's totally different. I have no doubt that my setup is going to smash through most any deer situation that I have. When it comes to elk, man, right now I did some math real quick this morning for some of the stuff we were doing, and I've got 96 foot-pounds of energy that's coming through that bow with that arrow setup that I have right now with the extortions. Man, it's hard to stop that, but it's happened. I shot an elk a couple years ago, on his shoulder, and it was like I didn't do anything to it. Arrow hit it and hung out the side, and I had to shoot again. So, there's no guarantees, but you got to be smart about the shot placement you take, and understanding your effective range obviously is part of that. But just make sure that information that you get, whatever it is, try it yourself and think through it. Draw it out on paper if you have to, and it'll help you understand more about what your personal situation is.
How about effective range? What do you think about effective range? I guess it's different for everyone too. But what's your effective range on a whitetail, you believe?
Well,
I guess yeah, that's a trick question.
I'm going to lose no matter what when people watch this on social media. Well, first of all, it depends on the animal you're shooting. And it depends on how well you know the animal you're shooting. Like whitetails, I know inside and out. Am I an elk guru? No, I'm no Dan Evans. I'm no Randy Ulmer when it comes to hunting giant muleys. I've shot more than my fair share of good whitetails. If you look at my wall, I've got 9 booners and 2 200-inchers. I've got, I don't know how many, 40, 50 Pope and Young class animals or whatever. And I don't shoot as many animals as I used to because it's just not a huge desire for me. But when it relates to the distance I'm going to shoot an animal, I know that animal inside and out, a whitetail. I know what my odds are of that animal jumping a string based on his body language, the scenario. And again, did I call him in? Is he just walking through eating? Is he following does? Is he chasing a doe? All that stuff comes into factor. So I know those really, really well. If you don't know your animals really well, your effective range needs to come down quite a bit. Just because you can hit a baseball at 40 yards doesn't mean you can hit a baseball at 40 yards if you put it on an animal. So the animal's moving. Whitetails especially. We all know whitetails. Everybody's experienced that amount of string jump isn't we call a string jump. It's actually animal falling, but it's an incredible amount. It's insane what it can be. And so at different distances, depending on your speed of your bow, how much can you get away with? I really think you shouldn't be shooting any further. If you can hold a baseball size group, that should be the consideration that you have, like at a minimum, like that, or at a maximum. Like once you start getting above that in your shot placement or the distance, say you shoot a baseball size group at 30 yards and you get to 40 yards and you're shooting a softball size group, you probably got to stick to 30 yards. And especially if you don't know that animal well. Again, on other game, you've got more margin for error. But a lot of people talk about, I get so frustrated with watching or hearing about people who have like city hunts. And all you have to do is hit this pie plate 3 out of 5 times. Dude, a pie plate is like 9 inches. Like, how big of a pie plate? Yeah. But a 9-inch pie plate, let's take that for example. If you can hit a pie plate 9 inches at 20 yards, well, that sounds pretty cool in theory. But the average whitetail, you probably only have 9 or 10 inches of height. And you probably have less than that in width that you need to hit. So you really can't get away with just hitting a pie plate. Let's just say you shot at the top of the pie plate. Well, you're 4.5 inches high where you intended to hit. Factor in the whitetail drop too. Now all of a sudden you're 13, 14 inches. What's ethical? Because you can hit a pie plate? I don't think so. Ethics come in. I even hate to bring up the word ethics, but when ethics come into play, it really comes into your full understanding as a bow hunter. Again, what we're trying to relate in the series is everything's related to bow hunting with what we're talking about in archery. We're not trying to build target bows. But understanding animal behavior, understanding the animal you're hunting, that's all part of the equation. It's more than just being able to hit a paper plate or a softball or a baseball size target.
What are some of the common mistakes that you've seen people make in shooting, and it can be form based, but you've obviously experienced so many different things. What are really some common mistakes that you've seen and maybe some quick solutions on how you could fix those? Well,
you could break this into a ton of categories from equipment to form. I think one of the big things I see is that a lot of people now rely on their rangefinders. And we went over this today, actually, one of the tips. A lot of people rely on their rangefinders. The problem is that rangefinders, although they're very consistent and accurate, some models more than others, but a rangefinder, for example, when we shoot pro ASA tournaments, all of us there's usually, let's say, four people to a stake, and we're shooting for tens of thousands of dollars. Well, I might be shooting with Garrett Ayersman, or I just name a pro, it doesn't really matter. I'm shooting with 3 different pros, and Garrett might walk up there and he ranges the target and says, I got 46 yards. Well, I range it on my rangefinder and I got 47 and a half. How's that different? Well, they're just calibrated a little different, or maybe a different brand. Even a model within the same model within a brand may read slightly different. So a big mistake that I see, especially people who are wanting to extend their effective range, the further out you go, obviously a yard makes much more of a difference in your impact point when you get out to 60, 70, 80 yards. And I'm not advocating those distance of shots, but if you wound an animal and you need a second arrow in there, you ought to be efficient at it. Make sure that whenever you're putting your stakes in your backyard, meaning when you're sighting in, make sure you're using that particular rangefinder that you're going to be using in the field, because it could be off as much as 3-4 yards. I've seen them that bad. It's not typical, but it's possible. It's very common for it to be a yard or 2 off. So if you go on sight in and you have a really slow setup and you're sighting in at 20 yards based on a tape measure that you pulled out to where 20 yards is, you better shoot with your rangefinder to know that that's 20 yards. You're better off just going out in the field and ranging it and marking your marks where you're going to shoot 20, 30, 40 yards or whatever the case may be with your rangefinder, and then you'll use that in the field and you know that you'll be confident it's on.
Well, that's a really good tip, and I think it relates a lot too, because I do a lot of shooting at a local range here, and you show up at the range and they say, there's the target, it's 20 yards away, and there's the next target, it's 30 yards away and 40 yards away. Well, you know what, I'll be honest, I'm as guilty as anyone else. I go out there and I assume that that's 20 yards, and I assume that my rangefinder would say 20 yards, but you know what, I've never taken my rangefinder out and actually clicked it to check that it says 20 yards.
Yep.
So.
Yeah, and you can even, believe it or not, like if you're going to go hunt bears, for example, rangefinders work off of reflection basically, and to dummy it down a lot, they work off of reflection. Sometimes on some rangefinders, even expensive ones, if you range a deer and range a black bear standing side by side, you may get differences of up to 2 or 3 yards because of the color of the animal. Like we have some targets that we shoot, there's a taper target that's a white and a black target. Unless you're using a really, really, really high-end rangefinder, I've seen some of the best rangefinders range them, and they'll be 2 yards off when you range the white and when you range the black. That's, an exception, but those are the things to keep in mind. Like if you're going to go hunt bears, keep that in mind that, hey, that may range differently. You want to shoot on a black target with your rangefinder and make sure that's accurate. Again, it doesn't sound like a lot, 2 yards here or there, but all those things add up. When you start multiplying all of them together, then you run into situations where, bad shots occur, and maybe it wasn't really a bad shot, but you just had the wrong yardage and the animal moved and things like that. So, that's one of the things I see a lot of people make mistakes on. And then there's a ton of things on form, obviously. One of the ones we covered in the series was talking about shooting downhill or shooting uphill if you're a Western hunter. You have to understand how your bow works at those distances, and you really need to know that when you're shooting an arrow, that you have your form correct. A lot of people, when you're pointing down out of a tree stand, for example, on a whitetail, there's a huge tendency for your shoulder, your bow arm shoulder to rise. And when it rises, that changes your draw length, basically. You're going to have a hard time aiming, keeping your bow stable. A lot of things are going to go wrong then. So you want to tilt at the waist, as we were talking about before. You want to tilt down and draw your bow then, and keep a straight line from your wrist all the way back through your rear elbow. There's a ton of things, but just a couple examples there.
Yeah, that's good. And that was a pretty cool demonstration that you did that will be in that video series. It was funny watching you try to do the wrong way.
Yeah.
So we took some still shots and you'll see those in the video series, and you can definitely see when he does it the wrong way versus doing it the right way, and that was super helpful for myself as well. But it was interesting watching him try to do it the wrong way at first. I took a picture and then took a picture of him doing it the right way, and I flipped back and forth and I said, Rod, I don't see a difference.
Yeah. To me, it felt huge. I was like, wow, I can't believe I'm even doing that right now. But it's just so ingrained in me because I've shot so much. It's what practice will do for you. We're coming in time of year right now. Usually July 4th is when archery shops get super hot and people are really start shooting their bows. We're at the end of May right now, but honestly, you should be out there right now with your bow working on it. Whether you travel or don't travel to hunt, you just need to be out there and shoot. I work for the NFAA, which is a National Field Archery Association. I'm the bowhunting ed coordinator, or not bowhunting ed, but the bowhunting coordinator there, and I do a lot of the event stuff, handling some of the social media stuff. And that's a great organization. If you have a field archery range near you, you can call up the headquarters and say, hey, I'm looking for a field archery range, and they have a list of field archery ranges that are in different areas. Field archery will really, really teach you what you need to know about your bow and your form in a hurry. You'll shoot a lot depending on the course, but you'll shoot a lot of steep angles, uphill and downhill. You'll shoot a lot of close targets, a lot of far targets. Our closest target we shoot is 4 yards. You would think 4 yards, you'd be shooting your sight somewhere up around 20 yards. Well, 4 yards, I have to set my sight to 67 yards to hit where I want to. Sounds pretty crazy, but there's some weird parallax things going on that we could get into. We're not going to get into them now for sure, maybe in one of the episodes, but your arrow rises as it comes out of the bow. You're looking at a lower plane of view than what the arrow is rising up above. So at a certain point, when you get up closer, your arrow is going to start hitting lower and lower and lower. So you have to shoot for a lot farther yardage than what you normally would. If you're shooting an animal that's, if you're shooting downhill at a muley in really steep country in Canada, or you could be in Montana and shooting almost straight down on an animal, man, you're really shooting probably at the horizontal distance. You might be shooting 50 yards to that animal, but the horizontal distance is only 4 yards. You need to know you need to shoot that for like 67 yards to hit where you want to. So yeah, there's a lot to learn about your bow, and field archery really teaches you that. So I encourage people to do that. Shooting 3Ds is really cool too. But the thing with a 3D is, and why people like 3D too, is that the kill zone where you're trying to hit isn't marked. I mean, not visibly marked. But with a target on a field face, it's very visibly marked. There's no forgiveness. And a lot of us shoot 3Ds, and like I hear it all the time when somebody's shooting a course and like, well, it still would have killed him. Yeah, you're 6 inches off, dude, where you were trying to hit. So, man, I don't know. Maybe you should go back to the drawing board and think about that a little bit. It's just too easy to have a cop out with 3Ds, which is why people like them, and they're fun. But
so if somebody's pulling their bow out right now, we got 4 or 5 months till the season. What kind of like how many arrows a day, a week? What kind of schedule should they kind of put into place?
I think it kind of depends on your experience and your level already. If you're somebody new starting out, be prepared to shoot. I would say 30 to 45 arrows a day at least. You can do it just like you're going to the gym. Get up in the morning, just make it a routine. In the morning, get up and shoot some arrows. And you don't have to log all your arrows by any means, but try to make it through 30 arrows if you can. And that'll help you more than anything else. Really get to understand your bow more. And once a week, pull out that iPhone. If you don't have anybody to film you, hit record and set it on a tripod and shoot a few arrows and look at it. I'm like, what am I doing right? What am I doing wrong? Even if you don't know archery inside and out, you can look up some stuff online and understand what basic form is. And I know we'll talk about some of that, but geez, you just need to get out and practice your bow. And I don't think a lot of people do that. I know Almer used to talk about he would go out and shoot one arrow in the morning, and that was he didn't have time to shoot all the time. He was a horse vet, and one of the greatest shooters that we've ever seen can shoot competitive archery and hunting. I mean, he shoots unbelievable animals. He would get up and shoot just one arrow, like, because that's what you would do in the field. Like that first arrow for me is a little rough. When we go hunting, sometimes I'll get up in the morning, I'll just shoot a couple arrows in the basement, just at 3 yards, just so I'm a little bit loose, especially when it's super cold weather. That's another thing right now. It's hot in the summertime. Man, put on the gear that you're going to be using in the fall. I know it sucks, but you might find out that your draw length's too long and you're hitting your sleeve, or maybe your grip's wrong. You can change that. You have lots of time to do that between now and then. So now's a good time to test out a lot of things with your setup.
And shoot broadheads, right?
And shoot broadheads.
Every now and again.
Yeah. And even, I really got to drive this home too. If you're shooting mechanicals or you're shooting expandable type broadheads, you can read on the side of the package, it says flies like a field point. Probably does fly like a field point, but it probably doesn't hit with your field points, especially when you get out to longer ranges, 40, 50, 60 yards. You'll see them start to separate. It has to. There's drag that's created by having a bladed or a different, you have a different type of projectile. If you had a field point that looked just like a field point with no blades, or blades that were contained within that field point, yeah, it's probably going to hit the same place. But you change a lot of things when you take a broadhead and put it on an arrow. If your field point's a half an inch long and you put on a broadhead that's 2.5 inches long, that changes what we call the FOC on your arrow, the balance point on the arrow. That's going to change how your bow is tuned. So you need to make sure that you're taking those things into consideration and practicing with them now. Like you said, especially if you're shooting bladed broadheads. It may seem like it's way too early, and it's never too early. Really shouldn't be changing your setup much between now and then, other than what you need to do to improve.
And if they watch Deer Society this series, they're going to learn all about that, right?
Yeah, and I think what we're aiming at too, that I hope people understand, is we're trying to engage you as a bow hunter with your equipment, to understanding how your equipment works. So not necessarily giving you all the answers. We're not going to tell you what to do with a left tear necessarily, at least in the beginning. We're not going to tell you, if you have a low left tear, you need to do this, this, and this. What we're going to try to get you to understand what is an effect of a low left tear. When that arrow comes out of a bow and you put a blade on the front of it, if you're shooting fixed blade broadheads, if you have a low left tear, the tail end of the arrow is coming down low left, more than likely the blades are going to straighten that arrow in the direction in which that tear goes. So if a low left tear, like from my position, would be like this coming out of the bow, knock in low and to the left. Well, when that angle occurs like that and the arrow's being forced, you have blades in the front and they're wanting to shoot straight. They're wanting to cut through there straight. So, and the bigger the blade, the worse it's going to get. And if you go to a 2-blade, it gets really bad. So, just fixing it by slapping on a bunch of feathers isn't really the correct answer, or long vanes. That's not the answer. Tune your bow correctly and, make sure that you have the right spine arrow to begin with.
Yeah, and that's something that, like you said, we're going to show you in this video series, and we'll actually show you in slow motion what a correctly spined arrow for that bow looks like coming out of the bow, and then what an incorrect spine looks like coming out of the bow. And in slow motion, you can definitely see the difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's what we're trying to do. I think we're really trying to help people understand, get the concepts in their head, and then you can better diagnose yourself. And yeah, sure, certain scenarios I shoot through a piece of paper and I've got this kind of tear. Okay, well, you can do these three things likely. Well, there may be variables in there that you're not considering. Maybe your veins are contacting your rest or your cables. So the goal of the series really is to get you to start thinking through that stuff with your bow and arrow set. And really things in general we talk a lot about because it's hunting related. We're going to be talking about hunting scenarios in this quite a bit. It may not be just archery related. So we get the same concept down to you. It's just like we did with the deer call. I mean, that's the one thing I think that separated us from everybody else with the extinguisher call was we were laying out videos where I was explaining, hey, when you hear this sound or when you create this sound, this is what you're saying to the deer. This is what the deer is interpreting that as. And depending on his mood, he's going to react this way or that way. That's what we're trying to get you to get your head around. And I think that's why so many people are successful with extinguisher. They watch the DVD and they start thinking about, oh man, his ears are pinned back. Wow, what could that be? And he looks angry. Okay, well, start to break it down. And I know I've talked to people after seminars and talked to people after a year of hunting with the extinguisher, and they're like, wow, I get it now. I can start to diagnose things on my own. I start to break it down on my own. The whole teach a man to fish kind of thing. We don't want to give you the fish. We want to teach you how to fish kind of deal. And teach you how to hunt, teach you how to shoot, and how those two things work together.
I can't help but say this because I've just been thinking it here for about the last 5 minutes. Has anybody ever told you kind of look like Phil Mickelson?
No.
See it? Adam sees it back there. Yeah, there you go.
Need to watch more golf, I guess.
Phil
Mickelson. That's an
Mickelson.
insult or
No, it's a compliment. Or maybe Phil Mickelson looks like you, but I've just been thinking it here for about the last 5 minutes, so I had to ask.
Don't be going weird on me.
Oh man. So tell me, do you have a particular hunting experience that stands out above the rest?
Man, you know what? I guess it would be because I listen to so many people get caught up in the inches of antler thing. And I think probably the most profound story that I have was, and I don't know if you filmed that deer or not. I know Kurt Rotter did, a 200-inch deer that I shot, a 202.
Nope.
This goofy thing, I should say goofy. It's a very typical looking deer. I swore that deer was 160 inches. 3 different times I let him walk right underneath me and just let him keep walking. And that same year, it was shotgun season was coming up, and you can't shotgun hunt, or you can't bow hunt during shotgun season in Iowa. And this deer was on a piece of property I was never going to have access to again. It was a piece that actually I had for sale when I was managing properties and selling real estate. It was a property that guy gave me permission on. I'm like, it's the last day of the season, day before shotgun season. If that deer comes out, maybe I'll stick. I was thinking about that on the way there, and it was freezing cold. Got to my stand in the evening, and I was hunting basically a food source coming out of some cedars into a big open cornfield. And I climbed up in the tree and sat there for a little bit and heard a stick break. I look over and flip, there's that deer. And I'm just like, man, I let it go 3 times. I don't want to be disappointed. I don't want to ever, I've done it before where I've shot an animal and I felt horrible. Like, wow, that's not what the quality of the animal isn't there trophy wise. Sure, the meat's cool and everything, but I know that's kind of the trend right now. But the reality is a lot of us hunt big bucks for whatever reason you hunt them for. It's not just for the meat.
Everybody, all of them are trophies, but each one of us, as we grow as hunters, have set different goals and challenges for ourselves.
And that silly thing, he was a 5.5, 6.5-year-old deer, and I'm like, you know what, I'm going to shoot him. I'm not going to hunt here again. What the heck? So I shot him. He ran over and he died, and I called my buddy Derek, who was working for me at the time, and I'm like, hey, shot this deer, I said, I think it's laying like right there. I feel like I hit it really, really good, but I had to shoot through a small hole in some cedars. Didn't hit any branches. Shot felt good. I'm certain it's dead there somewhere, but can you help me get it in the morning? It was morning. I think it was the morning of shotgun season. I said, can you help me go back and get it in the morning? I just want to make sure that it's dead, obviously. And I went back and obviously, I aced it in that situation. It was a great shot. It only went like 30 yards, just went over some CRP, and I couldn't find it in the dark. I didn't have a light with me. And it didn't bleed a lot. So we loaded up in the back of the 4-wheeler, driving it home, and got it home, put a tape measure on it just for a ha-ha. And I really thought this deer was 160 inches. It was 202. Worst mistake I've ever made scoring a deer. But that story for me, like really, it changed the way I thought in a hurry. Like I was thinking like, oh man, it's just a 160-inch deer, and I just wanted to fill my tag. And then I got to thinking like, wait a second, it actually turned out to be, a 200-inch deer. Not a whole lot of people see 200-inch deer, let alone shoot one. Should be super excited about that. And it just got me thinking about that whole process and going, man, why do I hunt? And I started making decisions then to let animals walk. I normally wouldn't have let walk in the past. And the decision of when I pull my bow or not pull my bow back, it depends on the animal now, and it depends on the experience, and partly because of that deer. Because, man, the value of that deer from a social media picture perspective was huge, and to my sponsors was huge. In reality, I mean, that deer is no different than a deer that was 160. I was happy with it being 160. It turned out to be 202. So, it's a weird thing deciding whether you're going to shoot a deer or not shoot a deer. And that deer in particular was something that really threw me for a loop. I'm sure everybody's experienced ground shrinkage, but I've never had an animal that grew that much. I mean, I've seen that deer so many times under 20 yards. I'd walk right underneath me, just let him walk and didn't think twice about it. But his eye guards are really long. His G2s and G3s are really long. His G4s are really long. And it added up, and holy cow, it's there, all day long. So, yeah.
It's an incredible deer. That's a cool story. A lot behind it that I didn't know. That's awesome.
Yeah. I mean, if you watch it on film, all you would see is like, oh, there's a deer in the cedars. Thunk, shoot it, and that'd be the end of the story. But, it was more meaningful to me in that, because it made me really think about like, wow, I'm not really doing this for inches of antler, am I? Because that shouldn't affect the way I feel about taking that life of that animal. And so that was a big turning point in my career for me personally.
That's awesome. We talked about that with Klaus on a podcast here a couple back, and that's just it. The kind of the way that the industry and the hunting perspective is changing, or kind of needs to change. We as hunters started hunting for a reason, and we grew and we hunt because we love it, and the industry kind of shifted that mentality a little bit into, are you shooting a 150-inch deer? Are you shooting a 170? Are you shooting a 200? And there's all kinds of different opinions on scoring and whether deer should be scored or not scored. But I think we're starting to slowly circle back, and people are realizing exactly what you said. It's about the experience, and it's not necessarily about that number, even though that number is cool. Shoot, I'd like to shoot 170-inch deer, this year too. But that's what makes it meaningful is the experience. That's awesome.
For sure. And I just think a lot of people need to maybe think about that a little bit. I mean, one thing I remember, I think I shot that deer after Stego, that 220 something I shot. But after I shot that deer, it was funny because the next year I hadn't had a deer down by shotgun season. And I was worried about my sponsorship because I had a giant sponsorship with Gander Mountain. And I remember calling Chris Ball, who was the vice president of marketing. I'm like, hey, dude, I don't know how this is going to affect me going into next year, but I haven't shot anything yet, and I'm like super stressed about it. He's like, what? I'm like, I don't want to lose my position at Gander or anything like that. I mean, I haven't shot a deer. I mean, he's like, dude, you've already shot 200-inch deer. I don't care if you ever shoot another one again. I mean, if you shoot a world record, that's super cool. He's like, we don't care. And that was like really started clicking in my head too. Like, wow, I was doing it before to maintain my sponsorship and to establish credibility so that I could do seminars and get paid to do seminars and get paid to do some of these other things and shoot people's bows and wear different kinds of gear. Well, it really didn't matter. I mean, I already established credentials. I'm not saying that, a guy needs to think about that as far as like everybody who goes out there and hunts is looking to get so many likes on their Instagram page or whatever. But it is interesting to me to think about how all that works. And I don't know if anybody's listening to this, does this for the hunts for the reasons of posting to social media. I mean, really break it down. Someday when you're in a tree stand, just think about it. Like, why are you out here? Why are you hunting? Is it for food? I mean, in some cases it is. I mean, for me, I'm coming home with an elk no matter what. I mean, I'd love to shoot a giant. I'm probably going to hold out until the last couple of days before but if I take home a cow on my $1,000 Montana bull tag, I take home a cow. I got meat in my freezer because it is the experience. Spending 30 to 45 days by yourself in the backcountry, it's for me, it's something I have to do. It's inside of me. And that's more important to me than actually shooting the animal. Along the way, you get to test out gear and sure have a lot of sponsor gigs that go along with that. But at the end of the day, that experience is, I mean, live in some pretty rough conditions sometimes. And, you know, I've got the right gear that gets me through it. I get to experience a level of, I don't know what the word would be. I get to experience situations which I normally would never be in. When you're out there by yourself, you're out there by yourself. It's you and dealing with those knucklehead grizzlies out there, and, you know, the dangers that come along with being by yourself. Those things are why I do what I do. It's actually not the shooting of the animal. I love shooting animals. Don't get me wrong. Love shooting animals. I love killing things. Tell everybody that. I love killing things. I'm not ashamed of that. But there is more to it than that for me. And as I get older in my career, I've realized that more and more. And I hope people just get that earlier than what I did, if that makes sense.
Yeah, very cool. Hey, you know, we don't have time today, but eventually it'd be good, and we're going to have you back, I believe, here this summer sometime for another podcast. You know, we could probably do a whole podcast on just, you know, your experiences in the backcountry, you know, spending 30, 40 days out there. I'm sure you've seen some incredible things.
Yeah, some rough stuff.
I can imagine.
A lot of good stuff.
Yeah.
But some rough things. I mean, went through some tough stuff, but it makes you tougher.
That's right. And so it's all about that experience, like you said.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, to wrap things up here, can you give everybody out there one tip? You know, we touched on it. Everybody, you know, is pulling their bows out, starting to, or will be here in the next several weeks, or hopefully they are. You know, if there was one real general tip that you could give, or piece of advice to give people as they're pulling their bows out and starting to practice in preparation for hunting season here in a few months, what would that be?
I don't know if you'd call this a tip, but it would be gaining the understanding that how you shoot an arrow is more important than the arrow you're shooting. Meaning, you really need to focus on improving your own ability to make the same shot over and over again, to make repeatable shots over and over and over again. That's more important than what your setup is. I mean, I take a well-tuned bow that's $300 off the shelf with $3 arrows over a $1,800 bow with the most expensive arrow on the planet and the most expensive gear on the planet, if I knew I had the right bow and arrow combination, and I know for sure that I'm executing my shots the way I'm supposed to. Practice. What it comes down to, practice. It's more important than the gear. Way more.
Awesome. Well, there you have it. Well, thanks, Rod. We appreciate it. Hopefully you guys learned something from this podcast. Go check out the archery series that's going to be launching here in a few weeks. Hopefully you'll learn all kinds of good stuff. There's really, really good information in there. You can check that out on the Deer Society app. It's free. If you're watching this on YouTube, make sure to subscribe, and thanks for tuning in.
Yeah. Thanks,
guys.